Chapter 11 of Concepts of Biology talks about evolution and its processes. The diversity of life is a result of evolution, and it's a continuous process that's still occurring, so it's of particular interest to quite a few biologists. We're going to look at how populations change, the mechanisms of evolution, the evidence we have to support our ideas, the concept of speciation or the creation of new species, and then some misconceptions about evolution. The theory of evolution by natural selection describes a mechanism for species change over time. That species change has been suggested and debated well before the time of Charles Darwin. The view that species were static and unchanging was grounded in the writings of Plato, yet there were also ancient Greeks that expressed evolutionary ideas. I copied that straight from your textbook because that's a really common misconception that evolution started with Charles Darwin, or understanding of evolution started with Charles Darwin. It didn't. Evolution was actually discussed even by Charles Darwin's grandfather. People were discussing various ideas about evolution. Pre-Darwin, James Hutton was talking about geology changing slowly over time, and maybe we would be able to track changes in animals. John Baptiste Lamarck saw that animals were requiring characteristics from their parents, but he incorrectly thought that you could acquire inherited characteristics. So he thought that you could inherit an acquired trait. So what that means is that giraffes have long necks because back in the day there was one giraffe that stretched a whole bunch, and that stretching created the long neck, and therefore the babies have long necks. That same idea is that a bodybuilder should be able to have an infant born with a six-pack because they acquired a six-pack. So there were a lot of ideas about evolution, a lot of writing about evolution before Darwin ever came about. Here is Charles Darwin, and then the man on the right is Alfred Russel Wallace. They both wrote scientific papers on natural selection that were actually presented together in 1858. So both of them explored the world, essentially, and took a lot of notes. Darwin did his travels first in the 1830s, and Wallace traveled between the 1840s and the 1860s. And what they both found was the idea of descent with modification. Darwin tends to get the credit because he did initially write his notes and wrote his paper first. It was just presented when Wallace also presented his paper. So one of the most common examples of what Darwin saw were changes in beak shape among finch species. He postulated that the ancestral beak shape of one species of bird was changed over time to create these 4 different species. And what that means is that these 4 different species, they're not competing with one another for resources, and therefore all 4 of them could live harmoniously on this island, eating lots of different things, compared to the island only being able to support one species because everyone was fighting over the same food resources. Natural selection, Darwin thought, was the inevitable outcome of 3 different principles. Principle 1 was the idea that characteristics are inherited from your parents. Principle 2 stated that more offspring, more children are produced every generation than are capable of surviving. And principle 3 stated that offspring are really variable among one another, and that some of those variations kind of give you a leg up and mean that you are able to compete a little bit better for those limited resources and are therefore able to survive. Because you survived with your special traits, you're going to be able to pass those special traits on to the next generation. And that changing of a whole population over time, that is evolution. In this instance, driven by natural selection. Darwin referred to this process as descent with modification. There are some more modern examples of evolution that we have thankfully been able to study. What you see in this picture is the change in beak size over just a very short period of time on an island called Daphne Major. So there was a married couple, the Grants, that were studying these finches on Daphne Major, and what they found is that their beak size was this nice bell curve as seen on the left. Small beaked birds ate small seeds. large beaked birds ate large seeds. But there was like a horrible drought on this island that they studied, and a lot of the plants that produced smaller seeds died. So a lot of the birds that ate smaller seeds starved to death. And what they found was that the mean beak depth, the average beak size in the island, increased dramatically over a 2-year time period, because the only offspring that survived were those larger beaked birds. So this is an example of natural selection driving evolution in a very short period of time. Natural selection and evolutionary change is largely dependent on variation or differences among individuals in a population, and those differences have to have a genetic basis. Genetic diversity in a population comes from 2 main sources, either mutations or sexual reproduction. Genetic diversity can kind of have 3 outcomes. Being different can make you more likely to survive and have offspring, which is referred to as your fitness. Genetic diversity can make you less likely to survive and have offspring, which reduces your fitness. Or whatever makes you different might not have any effect on your fitness. And we find that mutations and sexual reproduction fall into those kind of 3 categories. They can be helpful, harmful, or have no technical effect. When the difference, when whatever makes you different, makes you more likely to survive, we refer to that as an adaptation. Whether or not a trait is favorable depends on the environment in which you live at that time. As we well know, the environment is forever changing, so what makes you better suited right now might not make you better suited in the future, which is why evolution is constantly occurring. As we study evolution, we can look at a few different types. Divergent evolution is when 2 or more species evolve from one common ancestor. For example, all flowers share an ancestor. They have really similar anatomies, and we can pull them apart and we can see that. Hummingbirds and ostriches have a common ancestor, and one of the pieces of evidence that helps us know that is the homologous structures. They both have wings, and if you look at the anatomy of the wing, if you look at the genetic basis of the wing, you'll see that it's the same. Convergent evolution is very different. When you study convergent evolution, you'll see that some species that aren't related in the last, million years of evolution may actually appear super similar to one another, and that's because they evolved in similar environments, or they just evolved to have similar traits. So bugs have wings, bats have wings, but if you look at their anatomy, they're quite different. Bats have wings with bones in them. Bugs have wings made of membranes. So they kind of converge to look like one another, even though they are not related. An easier example for convergent evolution that wasn't in your book is kind of when you think about desert plants. Plants in the desert in Arizona can look really similar to plants in the deserts of Africa, and that's because they both evolved to deal with little water and really high temperatures. Nowadays, we understand evolution through the eyes of modern synthesis, and that's kind of a blending of genetics, the principles of genetics, and the ideas of evolution. We can back up our statements in evolution now with genetic data and genetic studies. The nice thing about modern synthesis is it's been able to kind of break up evolution into microevolution and macroevolution. When we study microevolution, we're looking at the changes that lead to a few new species here and there. When we look at macroevolution, it's changes on kind of a global scale all at once. A lot of evolutionary studies are based in genetic populations or studying gene variability. So what we can do is look at a given population and count the number of alleles that population has for one trait. Right here, you can see a graph that shows us the shift in population over time for having either these kind of salt and peppery wings or these really dark wings. So the vast majority of a population at a given time, everybody was kind of this peppery look. Being peppery meant that you did a great job hiding on particular trees, while being dark meant that you were easy to spot on trees and therefore easily eaten by your prey. However, in the example of the peppered moths, the Industrial Revolution happened and everyone started burning coal, and all of a sudden these trees surrounding cities or even in cities that used to be this pepper colored were covered in soot and pollution and nastiness, and all of the tree bark turned black and gross. So being a peppered moth actually meant that now you were a light colored moth living on a dark tree, so you were more easily eaten. So after this natural selection occurred, because you were easily eaten, you didn't survive, you didn't have babies unless you were dark, we saw the allele frequencies change quickly over time in just a few generations. And before, when we counted all the alleles in the given population, the population had way more light-colored alleles than dark ones. But thanks to natural selection, in just a few years, the population had way more dark alleles than light alleles. And that's how we can kind of use genetics to back up our ideas about evolution. We have actually seen a difference in the number of genes available to a population. So when we study the mechanisms of evolution, we look at natural selection, which we've already seen. You can study mutation, introducing new alleles into a population can make that population, or make certain members, or give certain members the ability to survive better than others. We can also study genetic drift as a mechanism, or gene flow. Let's take a look at genetic drift. So genetic drift in a population can lead to the elimination of an allele purely by chance. In each generation, a random set of individuals is able to reproduce and share its alleles with the next generation. So, I mean, every generation changes based on who had kids last time, last breeding season, last mating season. So in this image, you can kind of see a shift in allele frequency, so just counting the percentage of alleles you have in each population over time, purely because only certain individuals were able to reproduce. Genetic drift can be tied to chance or catastrophe. On the left-hand side, you see what's called the bottleneck effect, and that's tied to catastrophe. So a volcano goes off on an island, and purely by chance, some bugs die, some bugs don't die. The bugs that don't die survived by random chance. They just so happened to be, flying a little closer to the coast when the volcano erupted, so they lived. Well, they are going to have a different allele frequency than the original population, and now your whole population is going to look different just because a few individuals survived the volcano. That's the bottleneck effect. That is an example of genetic drift, random chance affecting evolution. On the right-hand side, you see what's called the founder effect, and that's when a few individuals they create a whole new population purely by chance again. So, maybe 4 red bugs are on a stick, and the stick floats to a new island, and now those 4 red bugs are going to make a whole new population of bugs. They didn't have some sort of advantage, like being red didn't mean that they survived floating on the stick, they just did. So now evolution is going to change, their whole new population is going to change, going to evolve, because they just so happen to be on the stick. So that's an example of genetic drift changing evolution. The final thing on that list, mechanisms for changing evolution, was gene flow. Gene flow occurs when an individual travels from one location to another and brings its novel alleles with it. So that brown bug and those green bugs, they're the same species. That bug just has the brown alleles and those bugs have the green alleles. Well, because the brown bug moved into the green bug location, it's now going to share its alleles with its new population. So the allelic frequencies of that population are going to change, and evolution can technically occur. Evidence for evolution is massive. I'm only going to talk about what's in the book. There are incredible amounts of information that you can study in this instance. We can look at fossils, which show the progression of evolution over time. We can look at anatomy and embryology, which helps us to examine the same basic form in many organisms with varying degrees of change. We can take a look at biogeography. The geographical distribution of animals follows the geographic change. We can also look at molecular biology. We can see that changes over time can be traced in genes and genetic structures. So when it comes to fossils, we have found animals like horses. We've traced them back to about 55 million years ago when they look like really weird dogs. But environmental pressures have caused them to become faster. It has given them better teeth for grazing. They have become larger and therefore better work animals. So horses have changed over time due to natural selection, and we can map those changes by looking very closely at their skeletons. And this image, this isn't from your book, I found this online. You can find some fossils for their forefoot, their legs, and you can watch the bone structure and the skull structure changed in that 55 million period of time. When it comes to anatomy, we can see the similar construction of appendages that indicate the sharing of a common ancestor. The forelimbs of humans, dogs, birds, and whales have the exact same bone structure. That didn't happen by chance. We share bone structure because we share an ancestor that gave us the genes to make that bone structure. We need to make sure we're not confusing simple similarities with massive similarities. To make a forelimb takes an incredible amount of genes, organization, and work. Something simple like coat color, however, is not necessarily because of a common ancestor. This fox and this bird are both white simply because of their environment. Being white is a lot easier to dictate through genetic change than creating a whole limb structure. Here's an example of that biogeography, being able to change the track the evolution of plants over a given space. So at one point in time, all of these continents were right next to each other. So it was really easy for plants to be in this one huge location. And what we have found, since these continents have moved apart, those plants are no longer sharing genetic information and have evolved over time to kind of suit their new environments. But when we trace them back in geological time, we can trace their evolutionary history backwards as well. It's pretty interesting. So we keep talking about the creation of new species and species changing over time. But what exactly is a species again? Maybe you've never really thought about it. The biological definition of a species is to be the members of the same species. You and a fellow species mate must be able to have fertile offspring. Your kids need to be able to have kids. And if you meet that classification, then you are members of the same species and you share the same genetic information. New species can be created through kind of two different pathways. There's allopatric speciation. So different fatherland, a species was split into two different locations, and they underwent a lot of genetic change and are no longer similar enough to have babies. Or we can look at sympatric speciation, and that's when species have the same fatherland, so they're still located in the same geographic space, but they're too genetically different to breed with one another again. So we're going to look at a couple different ways to undergo these mechanisms of speciation. So allopatric speciation, that genetic splitting, can happen two ways. Through dispersal. So some members of your population get up and move to a new location and can't come back to breed. Or through a vicariance. So a physical barrier splits a population into two different populations. They spend so much time apart, they can't come back together. Or we can look at sympatric speciation, and we're going to hold off on that for just a moment so we can get this allopatric speciation down first. So this right here is the only illustration that Darwin chose to include in the origin of species. And what he's showing us is these different colors of elephants and their ancestors have changed over time and have developed some of their biggest differences as they have been geographically isolated. There are elephants in Asia and there are elephants in Africa, and they look vastly different from one another, and they do well in very different environments. Another really common example of a species that was split was the spotted owl. Spotted owls used to have a nice big span across the whole western United States and Mexico, but now they are split in geographically separate locations due to a big old mountain range that's right there. And we have the northern spotted owl and the Mexican spotted owl. They shared an ancestor, but they have been split for so long that they have now developed different characteristics, different adaptations for their given environments. And they would no longer choose to mate with one another and are therefore different species. It's important to note as we talk about all these speciation processes that one species doesn't necessarily just become two. Here we see an example of honey creeper birds that have undergone adaptive radiation. And this is an example of one species becoming many different types of honey creepers. So please don't limit yourself as you consider these examples to one species only splitting into two. They can actually split into many. The most common example that we run across are the squirrels of the Grand Canyon. The canyon didn't used to be there. Obviously, it has evolved over time, and as it evolved, it split a population of squirrels into two different groups, and we end up with the north rim squirrels and the south rim squirrels. The north rim squirrels are more adapted to the really cold winters up there and have higher fat resources, or fat reserves, I should say, excuse me, and much fluffier tails and fluffier bodies. Well, the south rim squirrels are more suited to the hot summers, so they're very skinny and they don't have much fur, but it's a good example of this allopatric speciation. They have just changed over time to suit their given environments. So let's take a look at the sympatric speciation, because that's usually a lot harder for students to understand. How do two different species diverge from one another in the same place? Like there aren't any genetic barriers, or you wouldn't think there would be any barriers to keep the offspring from mating with one another. And what we end up with are something called audiploidy. So what happens is, in these situations of sympatric speciation, it's generally plants that we're talking about, and what happens is the plants create spores with different numbers of chromosomes. And because plants don't have nearly as many dangerous proteins or enzymes, if they accidentally create spores with new chromosomes, it doesn't matter. They survive just fine. So one plant, can create thousands of spores. So if only a few hundred of them survive and they now have double the number of chromosomes, those spores are no longer going to fertilize pollen from the old plant, but they can fertilize themselves. And in one generation, you have created a plant with totally different number of chromosomes. It's probably going to have some different characteristics, but it will survive just fine. Here's another example of how that actually can occur. So you can see one species creates a perfectly normal gamete, and another species accidentally creates a polyploid gamete, a gamete where it didn't split any of its chromosomes. But those two gametes come together anyway, and you end up with an organism that has an odd number of chromosomes. You might be thinking, well, in meiosis, we always split everything down the middle. You can't split an odd number in two, so what are you talking about? It just comes together with another awkwardly numbered gamete and creates a plant that has an even number of chromosomes. I realize that sounds super odd. And it doesn't sound like it should be variable or should be viable, It doesn't sound like those plants should be able to survive. But because plants are capable of self-fertilization, and because plants are capable of mixing awkward number of gametes together, they can survive these strange polyploidy and alloploidy instances just fine. And you come up with brand new plant species in the exact same field as their parent plants that have a very different number of chromosomes and a different set of characteristics. There are different barriers that come up in these situations that keep new species apart from one another. So we say we separated these owls for 100 years. What's keeping them from from mating if they ever do come back in contact with one another, we can consider pre-zygotic and post-zygotic mechanisms that might keep those owls from mating if we brought them back together. There are 4 different, we call them barriers, that will keep them from mating in the first place. So one might be temporal isolation. Those different types of owls might choose to mate at different times of the year. The females might be ready to have babies in spring, but the males are not ready to reproduce until fall. So those 2 species are not going to mate. They might be ecologically separated, so they're looking to mate in different locations. Maybe one, travels to a different type of forest to mate, and one travels north and one travels south in order to mate. Well, they're never going to meet. Their behaviors might isolate them. Maybe the birds have started singing different mating songs, so they don't speak the same language, so they're not going to choose to mate. Or their isolation maybe might be mechanical. They might have developed differently shaped genitalia, so they can no longer undergo sexual reproduction, and that might keep 2 species separated, even though they used to be able to mate with one another and create fertile offspring. There are some post-zygotic barriers that can keep new species apart. In post-zygotic barriers, usually we're looking at the hybrid viability or fertility or their breakdown. So 2 different species. They used to be one species. Donkeys and horses have a common ancestor. But now when donkeys and horses mate, they can produce mules, but those mules are infertile. Therefore, we consider donkeys and horses 2 different species. They can't have fertile offspring. In some cases, 2 species might come together and produce an offspring that never make it to adulthood. We refer to that as inviability because they don't survive. Or a final example of a post-zygotic barrier why 2 different species won't come back together is because the hybrids break down. So maybe their hybrids do survive to adulthood and they can produce offspring, but that second generation, that F2 generation, they don't survive. So there are a lot of barriers that keep species from coming back together. We do have some examples of speciation that we're still finding, and we're still kind of surprised by them. These are artistic renditions of cichlids from Lake Victoria in Africa. These fish are all the same species and they all live in the same lake, but they're an example of an animal undergoing sympatric speciation. And what happens is the mouth of these fish has kind of slowly developed to be a little bit different than the other cichlids, and it allows them to feed from another food source. So this population can support like 100 different species of cichlids purely because they have different plant sources that they're feeding off of. So this is an example of sympatric speciation in animals. It's not very common, it's not very well understood, but we do see this sympatric speciation. And it turns out that these 2 different types of cichlids, in this instance, they're showing you the different lips. These won't mate with one another, so technically they're considered different species. The last section in this particular chapter is common misconceptions about evolution. We're just going to fly through these really quick. Misconception number 1 is that evolution is just a theory. If you ever come across someone who says that something in science is just a theory, they clearly don't understand the basic foundations of science, because it takes a ridiculous amount of work for something to be considered a theory, and it takes many years and hundreds if not thousands of scientists' input to create a theory. So someone who says just a theory doesn't understand the definition of the word theory. Another common misconception is that individuals are capable of evolving. When we're talking about evolution, we're discussing a whole population changing, a whole population shifting to a new norm, essentially. Evolution doesn't even attempt to explain the origins of life. Evolution is attempting to explain how life changes, not where it came from. Organisms don't evolve on purpose. They can't decide to evolve, and they're not evolving towards a higher order goal. They are just changing in response to their environment. Evolution is controversial. Another misconception is that evolution is controversial among scientists. It's not. There are some people that are upset with the idea that evolution can explain the origin of life, but evolution as a mechanism for changes in population is just not negotiable for anyone who understands the data. And the last misconception they discuss is that other theories should be taught in evolutionary science courses. Evolution is a science and is therefore taught by scientists. Kind of other ideas that are not science-based shouldn't be taught by scientists because we're not experts in those. We're experts in evolutionary science, so let's continue to teach evolution. With that, we end chapter 11. You should read your book, take notes in your own words, check out some of the amazing animations and kind of visual representations of these ideas because they'll really cement them in your head, and then take a crack at your homework.